Solar was under attack in the Texas legislative session that recently ended. Now it's under attack in Congress. Why is this happening for a resource that has delivered so much benefit? We dive into that in this episode of the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin, and this week I was joined by not one, but two guests. Sean Gallagher, Senior Vice President of Policy for the Solar Energy Industries Association, and Daniel Giese, Texas State Director for SEIA. A quick note, we recorded this pod last week before the Senate version of the reconciliation bill, the budget bill, was released. So we got into what happened in the House bill. We talked a whole lot about what happened during the Texas legislative session. We talked about the meteoric rise of solar and what that has meant for the state of Texas. We got into all kinds of things, but not the Senate version of the bill. We will put in the show notes. You will be able to find there SEIA's statement on the Senate bill, but we will not discuss it in this episode. This was a great episode. Really enjoyed talking with Sean and Daniel. I think you're going to learn a lot from this. As always, please become a subscriber to the Energy Capital Podcast and the Texas Energy and Power newsletter at DougLewin.com. Please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen, and please enjoy the show. Thanks for listening. Sean Gallagher and Daniel Giese, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thank you, Doug. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
You guys are doing great work at SEIA on behalf of the solar industry, and obviously it is a fascinating time, too fascinating in my view, what's going on in the solar industry. Let us start with Texas. We are definitely going to jump to talking about federal and what's going on in Washington, D.C., but it's the Energy Capital Podcast, and I cover Texas. So, Daniel, we'll probably start with you and maybe just kind of introduce yourself very briefly, but talk to us. You're obviously leading things in Texas. Why, in a state where solar is delivering so much value in the state, are we still seeing these legislative attacks? I get asked this all the time, and I feel like I'm really struggling to explain it. So maybe you could help me, Daniel.
For sure, yeah. So we had a, session just ended this month. And, like you said, there's obviously going to be challenges in a legislative session. There's no limit on, what types of bills, how many bills legislators can file. This year we saw over 8,000 filed. At the end of the day, only about 1,200 of those actually pass, but you have to keep them all serious. And so there was probably over 200 bills that, I was personally tracking, people in the industry tracking that touched on our issue. Unfortunately, a lot of those were negative. But, we made it out okay. It was actually a pretty good session for clean energy, for energy in general. Nothing bad happened to us. Other like past legislative sessions, there's been some more challenging legislation passed. This time around, though, I think cooler heads prevailed, and legislators they just did simple mathematics that you cannot meet the demand that this state is seeing. That's through population growth of people, growth of businesses moving in, the types of businesses moving in that are using incredible amounts of energy. They're going to need energy when they get here. They can't sit around and wait. So the simple supply and demand won out at the end of the day. And legislators, cooler heads prevailed, and they just saw that the only way to meet the demand that's coming is through clean energy growth in general, and all of the above.
I think that's right. And I just continue to wonder because, and I put together a podcast and video that's on YouTube with some of the testimony during Senate Bill 819, right? You just see so many folks, particularly from rural, deep red districts, talking about what solar and wind, but we heard a lot of testimony very specific to solar, what it means for them. Thinking to the gentleman from Nacogdoches County who's like, I'm paying for my kids' college with lease payments out of solar. Like, these benefits are very, very real. I mean, we're seeing landowners get millions and tens of millions of dollars of payments. We're seeing school districts getting huge amounts of tax base. But then you have some, and I appreciate the way you're putting this, that like cooler heads prevailed and most people realized it's good. But there is this vocal minority that even when their districts are benefiting so much, seem to be very stridently anti-solar. Like, how do you explain where that's coming from? The answer I've been giving lately is algorithms. I think people are spending too much time on Twitter and their feeds are giving them a bunch of misinformation. But is that your answer, or where do you think that's coming from?
You've kind of seen the issue wrapped up in, historically, Texas has been an all the above state, gone all in on all types of energy. And that's just simply because it's good for the economy. Lower bills for constituents is popular with their elected officials. And, we've kind of been wrapped up maybe in some of the culture wars of to be this type of legislator, you need to be against this type of energy. I think a wide majority of people don't see that, but obviously it's challenging when you're wrapped up in that. So we did a study along with some other stakeholders at the beginning of session on the economic impact of renewables in Texas and found that, nearly $30 billion in landowner payments coming from clean energy, $20 billion in local taxes paid. And these are taxes not going to the state. These are taxes staying within local counties, the county commissioner's court, the county hospital districts, local schools, going to roads, and just infrastructure that's needed.
That is, I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want to emphasize that that is billion with a
That's
B.
that's with a B,
We are
yeah.
talking tens of billions of dollars of benefit to the state. And it still just baffles me that
Right.
there's like opposition to this.
And that's a lot of the clips that, you put together on the hearing you mentioned on SB 819, which was, I mean, really an amazing hearing and sort of not the traditional type of hearing you see in a Senate Business and Commerce hearing for people that follow the legislature. Just a vast, diverse coalition of people who call themselves environmentalists, people who call themselves conservationists, people who don't care about that issue at all, but, host these projects on their property. So it's just important that private property rights played out and then that the legislators heard from the constituents who that would affect, that type of
Yeah, I just
issue.
want to read really quickly a quote you guys had put out. This was on a press release you guys had put out, but it was a gentleman who I featured in that very video, Michael Looney, VP of Economic Development at the San Angelo Chamber. San Angelo is in Tom Green County, and he says this is a quote from Mr. Looney. The western part of the county is challenging, even for grazing, given the lack of water, trees, and how rocky the terrain is. However, we have three massive solar farms that have been able to make it work. And there was a fellow from Armstrong County talked about we're dryland farmers. We don't have oil and gas. Like, we really need this. Well, I guess we'll continue to puzzle over why it's actually happening. But I think the point you made is the right point, which is cooler heads did prevail. There were more legislators that understood this is actually a really good thing for our state. Sean, I want to go to you. You obviously are with SEIA at the national level. You look around the country and see all the different states and what's happening in solar. I've talked about it on this podcast a bit, but it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective. Like, how does Texas actually rate nationally for what's going on with solar in this country?
Well, Texas has become hugely important to us, and one of the ways we demonstrate that is we hired Daniel a year or so ago, so that we've got someone on the ground there. Texas has been the fastest growing solar state in the country the last several years. Texas has installed more utility scale solar than any other state, including California, which was the longtime leader. And I think Texas now has the most utility scale solar capacity of any state. I think if you add rooftop in, California may still be slightly ahead. Texas has also been the fastest growing energy storage state in the country over the last several years and has among the most energy storage capacity in the nation. And that's been super important in meeting energy demand. I mean, the peak demands you had even a couple of weeks ago. And I think what's also relevant is that the discussion nationally is very similar to the discussion in Texas, right? If we want to achieve energy dominance, if we want to meet growing energy demand, if we want to do it reliability, we've got to do it with resources that are available, the resources that are affordable, the resources that can be brought online in a timely fashion. So those are some of the points that we're trying to make to the Congress as we have that discussion.
Yeah, you guys had actually put out some information that we are seeing a huge uptick in solar that is paired with batteries. And I think it's always important to point out that they don't actually have to be paired, right? They can be. You could have batteries on the system somewhere soaking up that solar power when prices are low and putting it back. Doesn't have to be co-located. But we
Correct.
are seeing this is actually about residential, but I think the numbers, I've got a slide on the screen for those that are listening, that in 2019 it was what, a couple of percent, and now it's looks like it's somewhere around 30% on the residential side. I think we've seen pretty similar on the utility scale side
That's
too.
right.
So that solar and storage pairing is pretty perfect, is it not?
Yeah, and you're right on both counts, right? Co-located solar and storage, very useful, particularly to the project developer who can sort of take advantage of putting out that power on the grid when it's needed the most. Storage, whether it's co-located with solar or elsewhere on the grid, super useful to the system and to its reliability because, as you say, it can soak up power either from the co-located solar or from elsewhere on the grid and deliver it when it's needed most.
Yep. You guys also put out some information. Texas installed the most solar capacity first quarter 2025, 2.7 gigawatts. To put that in perspective, the entire Austin energy service territory is about 3 gigawatts. So basically, an entire Austin worth of solar in one quarter. That was 92% more than the second rate state. We will have all sorts of links to these different reports in the show notes. I highly encourage folks to check out SEIA's materials. They're really great. I'm putting up on the screen for those that are on YouTube that we had the total consumption in Texas from solar reached just about 13% in the first 5 months. That's compared to 9% the same time period last year. So in the first 5 months of this year, basically 1 out of every 8 units of power consumed on the Texas grid were solar. That's 50% more than 1 year ago. I mean, this is just like meteoric rise. And it's just continues to sort of, it confounds me that anybody wouldn't be just like celebrating this fantastic thing that is going on. Daniel, I want to come back to you because I definitely like there's all kinds of attention, and I obviously have talked about it a lot here about the bad bills. Humans, we have this thing, right, of negativity bias. I'm not immune to it, but there were actually some really good bills passed in the legislature too. And that, it's like if it bleeds, it leads, right? So you just don't see as many news stories about the good stuff. Can you talk about some of the good stuff that just happened in the Texas legislative session?
Right. And you know this, but sometimes you're judged on, what doesn't pass. Like sort of the most popular thing, and people don't focus on the good stuff that did pass. But like really one of the bright spots of this past session was the popularity of DG rooftop solar. There was some good legislation to streamline solar permitting for backup power systems, batteries and solar on your house. We've seen, a lot of red tape around different areas of the state, which puts up barriers to allowing people to put their own energy independence into their own hands and do what they can to lower their electricity costs by putting backup power systems on their house. So Senate Bill 1202 will streamline the local permitting and gets rid of a lot of that local red tape. I think that goes hand in hand as well with legislation SB 1697 to direct the PUC to create a consumer guide for homeowners that are going solar, sort of similar to how the DOE has a guide to going solar, pamphlet on their website. Unfortunately, we saw over the past couple of years some of bad actors in the rooftop solar industry, but it's sort of what's different about our industry is we took that into our own hands and tried to get out bad actors and show that the industry is really doing things to make things right. And we SB 1036, which will strengthen consumer protection in the state, requiring solar salespeople to register with TDLR because, these are products that people in Texas really want. So they need to be able to, one, they need to be able to get it on their house in a reasonable timeline. And they also need to be able to get into relationships with businesses, that are reputable at the end of the day. Kind of going on that, a lot of good decommissioning and recycling legislation, HB 3228 and 3229, which will require recyclers to keep a database on what components they have and what plan they have to recycle these components. That's to ensure that there's not a lot of graveyards of devices that we've seen around. Additionally, HB 3809 will create decommissioning standards for battery energy storage systems, and then HB 3824, which will require battery systems to have fire safety plans. So it's just a lot of proactive steps, which, a mature industry takes, a responsible industry takes. So some people could see that and say, well, why are you doing these things which make you do something? But that's what, good actors do. And that's really what you saw this session was problem solving.
Yeah, it's interesting, Daniel. There's some folks out there, some legislators that say industry will come in and meet with them and try to work through things. But we really see on issues where legislators do reach out to industry and say, hey, there's a real problem here and I want to solve that problem. I think the evidence and the data suggests that regardless of anybody's opinion, you can look at the track record because all those things you mentioned were just this session, but there was wind decommissioning 2021, I think, and then solar decommissioning passed in 2023, battery decommissioning in 2025, the added recycling bills you just mentioned by Representative Lambert, like those were all bills that I don't know the details. You guys probably didn't get everything exactly the way you wanted it, but you engaged. That's what the process is about. And you reach some kind of conclusion that makes the bad actors come. I mean, that's what I kind of look at on the residential side. Like clearly there's some bad actors out there and nobody denied that. So let's address that, but you do it in a way that addresses the problem and doesn't hurt the businesses out there which is the vast majority of them that are doing things the right way. Most wind and solar companies are recycling their stuff. Where you have ones that don't, that's where you pass a bill, but make sure that you don't cause all kinds of collateral damage while you're doing it, right?
Right. And I mentioned, only 1,200 bills passed, 8,000 filed. So obviously it's easier to kill a bill than pass a bill. So a lot of bandwidth. I'd mentioned a good amount of bills. That's a lot of bandwidth.
That was a long
spent.
list.
Yep.
Yeah.
A lot of bandwidth spent by the industry to get stuff done.
Yeah. Sean, I want to switch back and talk about national stuff, but anything you want to add on Texas as far as what passed or what didn't pass?
Well, aside from the fact that Daniel did a great job, I think what was clear in Texas this year was it was a real team effort. We worked with a lot of organizations down there. I think we've done a nice job of aligning interests. And it was that kind of work that led to the hearing you mentioned earlier, where we had landowners from West Texas come in and telling their stories, and that was meaningful. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done and with the coalition that we built in Texas to try to educate lawmakers on the realities of these projects.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good segue to talking about the federal, because I'm curious, Sean, like how is that playing out at the federal level? Like we did see in Texas a very, very broad coalition that was inclusive of, like you said, a lot of farmers and ranchers, but a lot of economic development, right? We saw a lot of economic development corporations, the statewide Chamber of Commerce, Texas Association of Business, through to like manufacturers and oil and gas, like all kinds of different folks involved because everybody benefits from low cost power. I think a lot of times in the sort of some of the way, not always, certainly maybe not even a majority of the time, but some of the time in the media, it's presented as a oil and gas versus renewables. But in the real world,
Hmm.
it's not really, I don't think, the way it's playing out.
Yeah.
I'm not following what's going on in DC nearly as much as I follow what's going on in Texas. What's that dynamic like in DC right now, particularly in the context of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as I believe is
Yeah.
officially called?
That is the official name of it. And yeah, we're working with a wide array of stakeholders at the national level as well. Of course, we're working with our member companies, with the other clean energy trade associations. We're also working with, and I'd say very prominently, the tech companies and other large businesses that have shown over the last decade that they're real big customers of clean energy. So the Clean Energy Business Association, we're working very closely with. You may have seen the other day, the Data Center Coalition put out a letter to the Congress saying, these clean energy tax credits are important to us. We need power. We need it soon. And we want to be able to procure this power. We're working with some manufacturing groups and others. And so I do think there's a similar breadth in the kinds of voices that the Congress is hearing from, because it is an economic development issue. It's an economic security. It's an energy security. It's a national security issue. This isn't just about our industry, although it is about our industry. It's about jobs. Doug, as you know, we've successfully onshored solar and storage manufacturing over the last 3 years, kind of an incredible way. We had, over the prior decade, lost a lot of that manufacturing capacity, primarily to Southeast Asia. In the last 3 years, we've seen tens of billions of dollars invested across the U.S., mainly in the Southeast, a lot of it also in Texas, to build solar modules, to build solar cells, wafers, the racking equipment, steel, inverters, sort of you name it. All that manufacturing has come back to the U.S. as a result of this sort of tax credit ecosystem that we have. And that's been good for communities. It's been good for jobs. It's been good for the economy. And it's been good for energy.
It's so fascinating because I just hear all the time from people that really don't like renewable energy. They'll say, well, you can't power the modern economy with renewables. You can't power data centers with renewables. They're 24/7 loads. But then when you actually listen to the folks that are developing the data centers and operating the data centers, they say, no, we really want renewables. Now, they won't say we're going to operate on 100% renewables, but they want to operate with renewables as much as they possibly can. For the obvious reasons, it's a zero marginal fuel cost and you're insulated from the price shocks that happen with gas from time to time, right? And
That's right.
for other reasons too. But there's certainly sustainability reasons. But in my mind, I think with the data center folks, it's cost is right up there near the top. Continues to confound me that people say you can't operate a data center on it. Then I talk to the data center folks and they say, well, sure we can, and we're doing it.
Well, Daniel and I, in fact, were down at a ribbon cutting for a large solar facility north of Austin. It's a 900 megawatt solar project that's powering a Google facility outside of Dallas. So, the proof's in the pudding. These kinds of projects are powering data centers, and these are the kinds of projects that those companies want.
Yeah, just read the news. There's a story on PPAs being, signed between these companies every day, a lot here in Texas as well.
Absolutely. Especially in Texas, we're seeing this. And this is like, again, just sort of astounding because I hear all the time, and this is, I think, across partisan, but you hear it a lot, particularly in Republican circles, that we really want to dominate AI race. And I just don't see how that's possible, particularly over the next 3 to 5 years. I could squint and say maybe in the mid 2030s, like maybe nuclear and geothermal and some of these things start, and even gas, carbon capture and some things like that start to pan out. But like in the next 5 years with a turbine crisis and the other technologies I just mentioned, not quite there yet, getting there rapidly, but not there yet
Right.
and not going to be there in the next 3 to 5 years. This is what folks are building: solar and storage.
I think it's important for us to say, and for your audience to hear, like, we're for all forms of energy sources. We're advocating for solar and energy storage, but we're not against anything. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if we want to win the data center race, that we want to win the artificial intelligence race, if we want to win the manufacturing race, like the time is now. Data centers and artificial intelligence companies don't want power 5 years from now. They want power tomorrow. They want power next year. And as you've noted in some of the things that you've written, 80 some percent of all the new energy resources that came online last year nationally were solar and energy storage. 80-ish% of all the new resources in the queue that are most advanced, that are most ready to get built, are solar and energy storage resources. And, yes, you're right. There are challenges with gas turbine supply chain. If you don't have it on order, you're not going to get it for 4 or 5 years. And that's not to say anything against gas power plants. It's just that they can't scale at the pace that the economy wants power. So why would you do something to suppress or depress or repress the installation of energy resources when the economy is clearly demanding more power and more power quickly?
And that's what I would hope that Congress, emulates what Texas did this past session is, we knowing what I know about our state leaders, our state legislature, they want growth and they want it now. And you're not going to sit around and wait and put economic development on hold to wait 5, 10, 30 years. You're going to use what you can now to power and keep the Texas miracle going.
And that is what the House budget bill would do. It wouldn't, I do think we would continue to see solar and storage built, but it would be less of it. It would be at a higher cost. And that would slow down the economy. It would set us back in the race to develop these AI data centers and all kinds of other things we need for the economy. It really would, if not put on hold, at least significantly not tap the brakes, but kind of slam the brakes on economic development.
The implications of that tapping the brakes or slamming on the brakes is that, as you said, energy costs are going to go up. So customers are going to spend up to $50 billion more on energy costs as a result of the bill that's in the Congress right now, if it passes as it's currently written. Tens or if not hundreds of thousands of people are going to get thrown out of work, and that's all avoidable.
So I think where I want to go next is to something you were just talking about a couple minutes ago, Sean, is the manufacturing piece and SEIA as an institution not being against other forms of energy production. This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately and just wrote an article called Energy Submission about that. China, as the Financial Times, I think they created this term. Nobody's told me I'm wrong yet. If somebody else created it, find me in the comments and let me know, and I'll give whoever deserves credit. But they called China the world's first electro state, right? Obviously, we're familiar with the term petro state, right? A Saudi Arabia or an Iran or a Russia, like, deriving their wealth from oil and gas resources. China made a very conscious decision a little over 10 years ago, like, we are going to dominate the electricity supply chain. So you were talking a minute ago, Sean, about over the last 3 years, a significant uptick in manufacturing of lots of different components in the solar and storage supply chain. What kind of baffles me is that people, so we've got some in the administration that say, well, we're just going to dominate oil, gas, and coal. Well, fine. We're already dominating oil and gas, particularly in Texas. The Permian now is the largest producer of oil on the planet. Why not dominate both? Why have only one half of the equation? Like, we're on this trajectory. And it seems to me, and I'm wondering if you're hearing this in conversations in DC, particularly if any Republicans are thinking this way, right? Like, this can be their success too, right? I think there's too much of a perception that, like, well, if any of this stays in place, it's all Biden's thing. Biden's going to get all the credit. Like, they have all the levers of government now. Everybody realizes that. If we continue to get an increase in manufacturing, they're going to be able to claim a whole lot of the credit for that too. It would be their success too. And maybe this is just old fashioned and hopelessly naive, but like I would hope it would be like an American thing, right? Like truly America first,
Right.
Republican
Right.
and Democrats. This is something we should all agree on is like we want to win these economic competitions of the 21st century. Is good for all of us.
Yeah, well, I think it's clear that the president and the leadership in the Congress do want to win this race against China, particularly around data centers and artificial intelligence. And look, we want to work with the Congress to give them a win that will enable them to say, yeah, this is our success, right? So we're not advocating to keep the Inflation Reduction Act, every word, every comma. We want to work with Republicans to give them a bill that allows the industry to meet the needs of the economy, to meet the needs of national security, and also allow them to claim some credit because there is credit to be claimed. You're right. And what we want to see is these factories. We've got tens of billions of dollars of factories that are right now sitting and saying, do I build this thing or not? Right? Because one of the things that we were aiming for with tax credits a couple of years ago is let's bring solar module manufacturing to the US first. Module manufacturing gets established, then we got solar cell manufacturing. Cell factory manufacturing gets established, wafers next, polys next. Everybody's waiting in line to make sure that their customers are there so they can build a factory to sell those customers. And we can keep that going if we make some modifications to the bill that came out of the House.
I just want to like double click on that a little bit more as to why that is so critical, right? Because regardless of what you think this country's going to do in terms of its energy policy going forward, it'd be hard to overstate, like, the rest of the world is moving to solar too, right? I mean, like, the stories in
Yeah.
2024, Dave Roberts at Volts did a whole podcast on this, if I'm not mistaken. If I am mistaken, we'll edit this out, but I think I'm not mistaken. I think it was his podcast. It was Pakistan, right? It was, like, the 5th largest in the world for solar, and they're getting, like, cheap Chinese panels. Like, the world is gonna demand this stuff, and if they're the only ones producing it, think of the power that gives China that we don't have an answer to. It's kinda terrifying.
Well, that's why I keep saying it's a national security issue as well as an energy security issue. You don't want
Yes.
the ability to produce electricity or energy to come from China any more than you want it all to come from the Middle East when it was oil, right? So we need to diversify the manufacturing base. We need to have at least a portion of it here in the U.S. domestically. We've got the policies in place that have demonstrated over the past couple of years that we can do that. We don't want to shut that off. And it's important to note, Doug, that it's not just the 45X manufacturing tax credit that sustains those factories. It's the 48E and 45Y and 25D installation credits that sustain those factories also, because that's what creates the market for those factories to sell into. It's not enough just to have the manufacturing tax policy. You got to have the whole ecosystem.
So, Sean, to be clear, those different provisions you just said, those require domestic content in order to get, so it's not specifically a manufacturing provision, but to get the tax credit, you have to show you have the domestic content. Is that right?
Well, let me just put a slight modification of the way you said it.
Sure, please.
It's sort of a three-legged stool, all right? And what we did in 2022 is we created industrial policy for the first time in decades in the United States to sustain manufacturing. Three parts of it are there's the 45X production tax credit. So if you produce a solar panel, you get a specific tax credit for each solar panel or inverter or whatever you produce. There's the domestic content bonus credit. So, which means if you're a solar power developer, you get an extra tax credit on your project if you buy domestically produced content. So that's the incentive for the installer to buy the domestic product. 45X is the incentive to the manufacturer to make the product. Domestic content bonus credit is the incentive to the installer to buy the product. And 48E and 45Y and 25D are the installation credits that help support the whole market. So there's a market to sell those products into.
Got it. So that's kind of the whole kind of wraparound of this. And you guys put out some stats recently. Daniel, I won't ask you to do this from memory, but I'll say the stats and then you can add in other stats if you have some top of mind or put some context around this. So nationally, you guys did a study and said I believe this was specifically based on the House passed bill, if the Senate were to pass it in that form. And I think I want to talk about this more. Sean, we'll come back to this after Daniel speaks here in a minute, but like, it's not going to pass in its current form. How exactly it's going to change, we don't know, but it seems highly likely, almost certain the Senate's going to change it in some ways. But if it were to pass in its current form, $286 billion in lost investment. So that's $250 billion in investment over 300,000 American jobs, 330 factories shuttered, 51 of those factories in Texas.
In Texas, yeah.
So that is like what, 15, 20% of the factories that would be closed are in Texas. That would include 34,000 Texas jobs, and then an additional $50 billion in consumer electricity costs. You could put any additional context or add any additional stats you want in there. I'm also just interested, Daniel, like, what are you hearing around the state from members, non-members, big consumers? Like, are we starting to see some of this activity already go away because of the uncertainty? Are folks kind of hoping that cooler heads will prevail in DC and they're still moving forward with investment? Like, what are you seeing out there?
Whatever happens, this is still a state that is going to have to meet demand by something. So I think you're still going to see energy growth happening. You just saw an announcement here. It's kind of near the solar facility that Sean mentioned, but T1 solar cell factory manufacturing just announced $850 million investment in Milam County, a rural county, which is a big deal. And right now there's over 12,000 people in Texas that work in the solar and storage industry. Like you said, by the end of the decade, if this bill passed as written, 34,000 jobs by the end of the decade would be lost, 51 factories closed. So it's a big deal. But I mean, like I said, this is still going to be a growing state. And so we have to meet that energy demand somehow.
Yeah. And I want to, for the folks that are watching on YouTube, pull up another. This is a chart that comes from Aurora Energy Research that shows the growth in solar. And we are seeing already, as a point I like to make a lot, Daniel, and I know you know this, but I want to make sure our listeners know it too, that we are already experiencing this demand growth. A lot of times the load growth stuff is talked about as a futuristic thing. In a lot of states, it is futuristic. In Texas, it's not. Our load growth is over 5% per year over the last 3 years, and it's 7.5% so far this year. If it stays at 7.5% this year, that'll be a 6% growth rate over the last 4 years, which is territory we haven't been in since the 1960s. And I still just think like one of the main, questions that just has to be asked and answered by folks who are defending this bill is, where is the power going to come from? If you're not going to be building solar in Texas and you've got hotter summers and AI data centers coming and got industrial electrification happening, you've got oil and gas wanting to hook up to the grid, like, where are you going to get it from if not from solar and storage? I still haven't heard an answer to that. I don't expect you to answer it, but you can if you want.
Yeah, we're waiting to hear too.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Sean, anything you want to add to that? Otherwise, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but definitely don't want to cut this short if you have anything else to add.
I'd just say you're exactly right. And look, 6% load growth annually. Think about it. The last 20 years, we've been in 1% load growth territory. So this is
Yep.
unprecedented.
Yep.
It's the worst possible time to slow down deployment of new energy resources.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, less than people listening are like, well, this is just people that like solar talking. We have had a number of different times, and he continues to say this. In fact, so ERCOT CEO Pablo Vegas was in San Antonio. I think it was this week. Sarah Di Natale at San Antonio Express News had some good reporting on this, that he's saying, look, we have to have more renewables on our system. The load is rising too fast to not have it. Chairman of the PUC in Texas, Thomas Gleason, said solar and storage are key for reliability in the state. We need them to be successful. There's enough sort of validation out there. If the folks who are running your grid are telling you you need it, you probably need it.
Yeah, they're the people tasked with balancing the demand and the load and everything. And they don't have the luxury here in Texas to, I like these electrons, but I don't like these electrons. They need every electron that they can get on the grid to do their job. So, that makes sense that they would say that.
Exactly. And I don't want to misrepresent their position, because they are also saying we need more gas, right? But you guys are saying that too. You're not saying we're opposing any gas plant. You're just saying solar's growing, let it grow.
Yeah, especially in these shoulder months where there's a lot of planned, unplanned outages of thermal generation. You can see, in the past, there would have been conservation calls like in 2022. People that lived here remember that. And nowadays, summer's boring. And that's really because of the growth of storage and solar.
Boring is good.
Boring is so good. I love boring. It's great. Like, I would love to not have conservation alerts, and it's good for my newsletter subscriptions, but I will be the first to say I'd rather not have the energy emergencies and rolling outages. I'll take the lower subscriptions and the lack of drama any day of the week, twice on Sunday. Sean, you were trying to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to add that you've seen some similar comments from Jim Robb, who is the CEO of NERC. NERC is the National Electric Reliability Regulator. And he's observed that the growth of wind and solar and storage in particular, are going to be absolutely necessary to meeting demand growth over the next several years and have been already critical in meeting heat waves and cold snaps and whatnot. So it's not just Texas regulators, it's national.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, Daniel, that you mentioned the shoulder months because we are recording on what is it, June 13th. And today I was looking at gridstatus.io, which is a great website, by the way, great for tracking grid conditions all over the country. I use it almost daily, probably daily. Who am I kidding? I think I have a problem. But thermal outages are up today significantly compared to what they were earlier in the week. And so what we're starting to see happen is they're able to take longer maintenance because there is so much solar. So they're getting themselves ready for those periods on the grid where there is scarcity and we really do need them. And they're able to earn higher revenues, right? So, like, in some sense, the shoulder months are contracting because we're getting hotter springs and falls. But as you are able to add more renewables, and then you get into these weeks where it's like, okay, demand's a little lower. We know we got all the renewables. They can take them back offline, do some more work on them, and get them ready to go. Really kind of a fascinating thing that's happening and showing how solar actually supports the grid.
Yeah, that's what I want a lot of our congressional friends and, people in other states to see, that the resources in ERCOT complement each other. And, you don't want to go all in on one type of resource. You want a diversified portfolio. The same way you're not going to throw your 401k into one stock. You're not going to throw your grid into one type of resource as well. So like you said, our resources just complement each other in ERCOT. And that's really a good example of that.
Sean, I want to actually come back and just ask you as well. Like, you've been at SEIA a decade. You guys have a lot of history with these tax credits. Can you give us a little bit of historical perspective? I mean, I know they used to sort of come in and come out a lot, but you guys played an early role in shaping them. And I'm sure through this period, this very tumultuous period we're in, you're going to continue to shape those. So I'm interested in a little bit of historical perspective on them and also kind of like future looking, not just in the context. I am certainly hopeful cooler heads will prevail, but what is kind of the long-term trajectory for these tax credits if we get through this period? They're probably not, I don't know. Are they around forever? Like oil and gas tax credits, the intangible drilling costs were established in 1913. We still have them today. I think we ought to be having conversations about oil and gas tax credits too. I'm not asking you that question, but I'm curious sort of, the historical perspective on these tax credits and where you think they're going longer term.
Yeah. So the solar energy investment tax credit, which is the one the most installers and developers use, was actually enacted when President Bush was president, G.W. Bush, right in 2005. Those tax credits have been extended by every president since, in fact. So a lot of people think of these as, the Biden tax credits, but in fact, this tax credit's been around for 20 years. It was extended by President Trump in his first term, and it has really fueled the dramatic growth that we've seen in this industry over the last decade in particular. Where it goes from here, I think it's a really good question. I mean, we could talk about what the bill as much detail as you want. I think what we're looking for from the Congress right now is something, well, let me back up and say, what came out of the House very abrupt, right? Turns the tax credits off effectively at the end of this year. That's going to strand a lot of investment. People have made plans, they spent billions of dollars, and they're going to see that investment sort of wiped away. So what we're looking for is a reasonable, business-friendly glide path or phase out, or, we need some more time so people can plan and make their adaptations so that people aren't thrown out of work immediately, so that factories don't close down suddenly, and that we can keep supplying the energy that the country needs.
Yeah, let's drill just a little bit deeper into what if the House bill passed, because I think my understanding is the two biggest problems with it, and you correct me if I'm getting this wrong or missing other elements of it. The 60 days after enactment, right? That you have to start construction 60 days after, which is like no runway at all. And then the foreign entities of concern that is really just, in my understanding, written extremely broadly to be like any component of a solar installation that had any part from a foreign entity concern wouldn't qualify, which is extremely bureaucratic, a ton of red tape, and would effectively, I think I don't know if you guys called it this, I've heard some people refer to it as unworkable, right? It's not something that would actually allow any projects to go forward. So correct me on anything I got
Yeah.
wrong and add anything else in that's concerning to y'all.
No, you're absolutely right. Those are two of the key concerns, and you're absolutely right that the FIAC provisions, as we refer to them, foreign entity of concern provisions, are unworkably broad and vague. And part of the reason is you just can't, it will be impossible for a developer who's the taxpayer and who's going to have to demonstrate compliance with the standard to go 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 levels back up the supply chain and have any certainty as to where a particular part may have come from. Again, I want to come back to the idea that we're trying to work with the Congress here on these issues. We understand their concern with the Chinese Communist Party taking advantage of American tax credits. We want to find a way to place some limits on that, and some limits on the ability of projects with components from foreign entities of concern to claim American tax credits, but in ways that don't shut down the industry altogether, which is effectively what the bill came out of the House would do. So we're trying to find ways to do just that, to make it workable, to align the actual language with the sort of regional goals of the Congress. And then in terms of the 60-day place in service, again, just an unreasonable restriction. It's too fast. It's too abrupt. It doesn't allow for any business certainty. And that's the case we've been making to folks in the Senate, is that businesses need a little bit of certainty in order to make plans. And the way that the bill came out of the House doesn't do that. And I think both of those points have been resonating, frankly. Senators understand where the industry is coming from. I'm hopeful that we'll see some improvements when we see language from the Senate.
So it's really just kind of the dissonance here, right? Like you can't have anything from a foreign entity, but we're also going to take away the domestic manufacturing incentives. So like you can't manufacture here, but you can't buy stuff from other places either. Like it makes my head hurt.
Well, I think this is this is part of what happens when you do energy policy through a tax bill is, it's the energy policy is
Right.
complicated, tax policy is complicated, putting the two together makes it really complicated. So you get some kind of weird sort of crossover effects. So we're trying to work with folks to make sure that they understand what the implications are of the things that they're writing, and that those things can be workable for the industries, again, so that we can keep putting energy on the system and powering those data centers.
Yeah. And maybe we can dare to dream, get to some like real bipartisan policy making, which has, like it almost sounds like silly to be saying that in 2025, but I'm holding on to that because we've done it throughout our history, right? I mean, the various energy policy acts. Daniel, you look young. You may not have been around, but Sean, not that you don't look young. You look very young, Sean.
Oh,
Sorry.
thank you.
Everybody on YouTube could see it, but I know you've been around a while. Like you've been around in some of these discussions, right? I mean, the various energy policy acts of the past where we have had, there should be wide agreement around so much of this. And I really think there is, if we could somehow figure out a way to get people out of their sort of polarized echo chambers and actually dare to dream, have some rational policy making and decision making. I think that we could get to a place where we would see more gas peakers and nuclear and more solar and storage, permitting reform, all that kind of stuff. Probably energy efficiency, probably a lot of things have bipartisan support, but we just seem mired in these kinds of, budget battles right now. Anything you want to say on that? I got a couple other things I want to ask about before we run out of time.
I think all I'll add on that is that I read something that a wise man wrote recently. He said there's no red electrons and blue electrons. There's just electrons, and we need all of them. So let's put as many on the grid as we can.
That was not a wise man, but thank you. Yeah, thank you for saying it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And honestly, like the solar and wind electrons tend to be more red at this point, right? I mean, you guys have done a lot of research on that. Daniel, maybe that's a good place to bring you back in too. Like in Texas and a ton of other states, right? We're seeing all kinds of development around this stuff. Well, here's what I want to ask you. You can add, Daniel, Sean and I were just talking for a while. You can add anything to that you'd like. I do want to ask you though, before we run out of time too, you guys represent not only the large utility scale, developers, but also on the residential side. This is a place where Texas has kind of lagged. We have not seen as much residential development. It's happening, of course, but not at the kind of pace and scale that some other states have experienced. What do you think as far as the prospects for residential solar? And do you think that some of the things maybe the legislature passed might change that, or some of the resiliency concerns around hurricanes? What do you see as the prospects for residential solar in Texas?
Yeah, well, you saw, I mean, you live in Texas, so you know that we face basically every type of natural disaster known to man, and probably some that we don't even know about that happen out in West Texas that nobody's paying attention to. So we have fires, tornadoes, hailstorms, hurricanes, and you saw there was a lot of good positive stories about rooftop solar in Hurricane Beryl last year, where the only houses that had power were that had solar and batteries on them, and they were sharing power with their neighbors. A very popular product, and actually during session I was tracking a lot of bills that were filed, or a lot of good positive bills regarding DG and rooftop that came from a very wide range of the political spectrum. So that just shows you that it is a very popular product with a lot of different types of people and different types of legislators with different types of ideas. So I would hope that going forward we will not focus on any of the market design stuff of the past or other sorts of permitting issues using the police power of the state to tell people what they can do on their property. So hopefully, in the future, we will be able to see that there's a lot of more legislation done that will, encourage rooftop solar, encourage demand response, because it's something that just is popular with everyone. It gives people their own power to do at their house what they want and to lower their own electricity bills.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about there being no red electrons or blue electrons, like having solar and storage at your house to be able to keep power on after a hurricane, or if we start getting to the place where there's power shutoffs ahead of wildfires or during ice storms or whatever it might be. I can't think of anything that is less red or blue than that. To that point, there is a PUC docket right now. The PUC is asked for questions, and when this podcast comes out, we'll still be within that comment period to make it easier for distributed energy resources to interconnect. I don't know if you guys are involved in that one. What are you guys looking at? What is SEIA in Texas looking at as far as PUC and ERCOT issues, whether that one or other ones during the interim where you guys will want to engage?
Yeah, so we'll be involved in that DER interconnection rulemaking. Now that session's over, that's when more work starts at the PUC. So there's going to be
Yep.
the 4CP cost allocation study under SB6. There's going to be, the way that ERCOT looks at its load forecast. The firming rulemaking, which will be coming up as well, will take up a lot of time at the PUC, I'm sure. I mean, it's the rulemakings from the different legislation that was passed this session. So it's going to be a busy regulatory world for everyone.
And to make sure, because listeners might be a little confused by what Daniel just said about firming, but for those that have been listening to the podcast and reading the newsletter, maybe really keying into some of the details, there was a firming provision in, I guess it was House Bill 1500, right, in 2023. There was a prospective firming. So obviously during the session, I wrote a lot about 3356 and 715 that would have made it retroactive and would have moved up the deadline, or rather the sort of implementation period, I should say, for firming. But again, there was a lot of negotiation, deal making around firming in 2023, and that is on the books. It's just prospective to 2027, 2028, but that's right around the corner.
Yep, right around the corner. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And that's for with the 715 and 3356 is where you saw a sort of even bigger coalition of people against that legislation, probably more so than SB 819.
Yeah, basically because if you have any sort of a contract in the ERCOT market, you were going to be affected by that. It was really a wild piece of legislation. All right, great. So we are almost at time. I have a bunch more questions, but I think I'm going to just ask you guys kind of just in closing, is there anything that I did not ask you that you wish I would have, anything you want to make sure we share with the audience before we end?
Well, Doug, if I can, I just want to make a couple quick points. We talked earlier about provisions of the House bill, FIAC bill, to place in service. It's important for your listeners and viewers to know also that SEIA has been active around the 25D residential credit as well. So
Yes.
residential solar really requires that 25D credit. It was pretty clear soon after the IRA was passed in 22, and as soon as the Republicans took the House in 23, that the tax credits were going to be on their sort of list, right? So we've been working really for 2+ years to shore up support from Republicans, both in the House and the Senate, to preserve these tax credits. That's why you saw things like 21 House Republicans sign a letter saying, don't kill these tax credits. It's why you saw things like 4 senators sign a letter that said, don't kill these tax credits. We've been working around the clock on all of these issues for the entire solar power sector, whether it's manufacturing or big solar projects out in the field or rooftop solar projects. We've had, I think, 5 different lobby days on Capitol Hill before this week. Actually, one yesterday and another one next week. So that gets us up to 7. A lot of work being done here to try to protect the whole industry. And we can still use the help of local companies, of customers, and others. You can go to solarpowersamerica.org. That's where we are sort of put our campaign to work on this bill. And it will tell your listeners or your viewers how they can get involved. They can write a letter to their congressperson. They can make a phone call. They can hold a meeting. If you're a solar company in Texas, hold a meeting with Senator Cornyn's district staff, for example. Those things are still important. We've still got some time to make some improvements to the bill, and we want to leave it all in the field. So the time's now to do all those kinds of actions so we can help your viewers and your listeners do so.
Yeah. And Daniel, before I go to you for the same question, I just want to say obviously the 21 House Republicans that sent the letter didn't sort of stick with that. We don't know what'll happen in the Senate, but I would just make the point for 435 members of Congress and 100 senators, for 435 representatives, 100 senators. If we want to have any chance of getting out of the debt crisis we're in, you have to have economic growth. This is a point I tried to make in that article. I will probably be diving much more into this in the next few weeks because I think it's just a critical point that is often missing, was that if you're going to get out of the debt crisis, if you want to maintain tax cuts, like whatever, frankly, like you can fill the blank, whatever your goal is for this country, you've got to have low cost power, right? I mean, if we're going to have any kind of, a lot of times the administration talks about we need a 3% growth rate. You want to get a negative growth or maybe 1%, maybe you can eke out 1% growth, increase power prices by 10, 15, 20%. It's a great way to slow down the economy. So if the idea is to extend tax cuts while still paying down a deficit, you better have robust economic growth. Robust economic growth requires low cost power. Solar is the lowest cost power. It may still be the lowest cost power. They take the tax credits away. It's just going to be a lot more expensive than it was before. And that's going to be a drag on the economy. So I appreciate you making the point. And say the name of the website again. We'll put a link in there because it is important people get involved. Like you said, all hands on deck, leave it all in the field. The website is again?
The overall website is SEIA.org, but the campaign website is solarpowersamerica.org.
solarpowersamerica.org, and we'll put a link in the show notes. Daniel, what would you like to say in closing? What else do you want folks to know? Or if I did not ask you a question that you were wishing I would have asked, you can answer that now.
No, yeah, I need to reiterate to go to solarpowersamerica.org, get that information about the reconciliation bill and how to get involved. But really to keep it, since I'm based in Texas, it's during this interim, if you're a company listening, if you're, involved in a solar company whatsoever, you really need to get involved where you have projects, talk to the local officials, all the way from state to municipality level, because it's so important that they need to hear about what you're doing in their districts. Because I've talked to legislators who a lot of renewable activity in their district, and they had no idea that was happening. So we need to do better at telling our story about what we're doing and the economic impact in the communities around the state.
And at the end of the day, that personal connection, we're human beings, we're social animals. That human connection is really, as important as anything else, if not more. So thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate you guys. We'll have lots of links in the show notes so that people can find more resources about SEIA. And yeah, appreciate you guys being on the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please like, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.